first thing Kato Izumo noticed about the Veth was not their ships, not the black geometric shadows they cast over the Kyushu coastline, not even the low harmonic hum that shook the fillings loose in your back teeth. It was their stillness. They stood in the ruins of Fukuoka port like 8-foot statues poured from obsidian resin, and they did not fidget, they did not breathe visibly, they did not look at you the way humans look at each other. Sizing, evaluating, flinching. They looked at you the way you look at furniture. Kaito had served the Veth for 3 years. He knew their stillness well. He was 21 years old, 4th ranked among the Shindu Compliance Corps. That was what the Veth called their human enforcement arm, their word for it translating roughly to useful instruments. And he had told himself, for 3 years, that working in the machine was the only way to blunt its edges. That the compliance work he did kept the quotas from being worse. That the relocations he documented would have happened with or without him. That someone had to speak their language. He still told himself those things at 0400 in his bunk, staring at the corrugated ceiling of the port barracks. He'd gotten pretty good at saying them without flinching. But tonight was different. Tonight the machine had shown him its actual face. He stood in the long freight corridor beneath Dock 7, hands at his sides, and watched Inspector Kale Veth, the compliance director's preferred interrogator, creature with 4 upper limbs and eyes like oiled amber, give the order for Ritsu Sanada to be taken below. Ritsu Sanada was 17. She was the daughter of Yusuke Sanada, who had been a lieutenant general in what remained of the Japan's self-defense forces before the Veth decommissioned the military entirely. She was small, dark-haired, and she had not made a sound when they grabbed her. Was the bravest thing Kato had seen in a long time. The plan was leverage. That was what the Veth called it. A transactional arrangement. Yusuke Sanada would sign the weapon certification. He would hand over the locational data on the 40 underground depots the Corps hadn't been able crack. He would do this because if he didn't, his daughter would be processed at the Inland Reduction Facility, which was a Veth phrase that Kaito had learned to translate into something far simpler and far worse. Kaito had known about the plan for 2 days. He had told himself in those 2 days that his position in the machine was more valuable intact than burned, that there were 100 Ritsus and 100 depots, and he couldn't save all of them by getting himself killed over this one. He watched them take her past the corridor junction. She turned her head as she passed him, just briefly, not pleading, not even afraid anymore, just looking at him the way you look at someone when you're done waiting for them to do the right thing. He felt the familiar excuses line up in his mind. He let them pass. Then he followed. The section of the dock where they held her was called the quieting room, which was another Veth phrase, and like all their phrases it said something real about what they were. The door was a single panel of resonance-dampening alloy. The lock was a Veth biometric, 3-limb contact, voice print, atmospheric pressure check. It would take 30 seconds for a Veth inspector to open. It would take a human with no access codes and no authorizations approximately 6 minutes. If the human had spent those 3 years paying very close attention and had 12 improvised tools made from salvaged scanner components in his jacket lining. It took Kaito 4 minutes and 40 seconds. He got Ritsu out through the maintenance subdeck, moving in the pockets of shadow between the dock's ambient lighting strips. She moved well. She didn't ask questions yet, which was smart, and when he handed her a secondary pass chip for the outer gate, she read his hand signals and followed his pace without prompting. Kale Veth's alert signal went up 11 minutes after they cleared the perimeter. By then they were in the back of a fishing jitney heading north on Route 3, and Kaito was thinking very hard about what he'd just burned, and what he'd saved, and what he was going to do next. "Your compliance corps?" Tsu said. It wasn't an accusation, it was an assessment, was Kaito said. She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that had already decided he owed her more than one night's work. "My father," she said. "I know. Going to him." He pulled a battered handset from his jacket. No Veth network frequencies, analog bounce relay, dead man's workaround, and sent 4 characters to a signal node he'd established 8 months ago, for a reason he hadn't fully admitted to himself until tonight. 4 characters, an old emergency code. The response came back in 17 minutes. A location, a time, a single confirming character. Someone was still listening. The man who met them in the cedar stand above Asakura was not what Kaito had expected from a handler. Mugen Tendu was 63 years old, built like a retired hammer, with a white top knot and the measured economy of movement that comes from spending decades making violence efficient. He had a young woman beside him, his granddaughter, Mickey, who had the kind of attention to her surroundings that made you feel like she was mapping the exits before she'd finished shaking your hand. With them were 5 others. Kaito assessed them quickly. The way 3 years of compliance work had trained him to assess rooms. The 16-year-old boy with the green bandana and the restless hands, who was either terrified or had too much energy for his own good, and was probably both, one in her 30s with the cloud print scarf. And the calm expression of someone who'd already done the math on bad outcomes. The barrel-chested man near 50 who smelled of motor oil and kept his right hand near his coat pocket. The quiet young man who hadn't looked up yet. And the oldest one, lean and weathered, who stood slightly apart and watched Kano, with the particular wariness of a man who'd been betrayed by the institution Kaito was wearing. Compliance Corps, the weathered man said. He got me out, Ritsu said. The weathered man looked at Kaito for another 2 seconds, then at Tendu. Tendu said, he sent the emergency code correctly. He knew the recognition phrase. He got here. A pause. Those are 3 things. They're 3 things, the weathered man said. Give him 6 more and maybe I trust him. His name, Kaito would learn, was Nindo Kurayami. He had been many things. He had more reasons than anyone in that cedar stand not to trust someone who'd spent 3 years being useful to the Veth. Kaito did not push back on any of them. Some debts you pay slowly. Tendu's group called themselves the Captor Network. They'd been operating for 16 months. Intelligence, logistics, quiet sabotage, the kind of work that doesn't announce itself. 7 nodes, 7 operators, Tendu at the center. They didn't have much in the way of weapons. They had routes, they had contacts. They had a very detailed working knowledge of how the Veth compliance apparatus thought. Which, Tendu said, looking at Kaito over a mug of bad tea, is where you come in. Kaito told them everything. It took 2 hours. He told them the structure of the compliance core from the inside, the chain, command, the blind spots, the communication protocols, the 3 inspection windows per lunar cycle, when the Veth's attention was elsewhere. He told them about the inland reduction facilities. He told them about the weapons depots, and what Kale Veth wanted from Sonata, and what the Veth's next compliance push was targeting. He told them what he'd seen in 3 years of being inside the machine, and he told it without softening it, without the editorial adjustments he'd been making to himself in his bunk at 4400. He let it be as ugly as it was. When he was done, nobody said anything for a moment. The boy with the green bandana, Kaito learned, said, so you knew about the depots the whole time? Yes, and you didn't. No, Kaito said. I didn't. Another silence. Okay, Kita said. Not forgiveness. Just. Okay. Let's move. Kaito thought he might like this kid. The Veth were not what people called them in the first year. When the ships came down, and the governments tried to negotiate, and the television networks tried to frame it in terms that made sense. Conquerors, occupiers, colonists, those words all implied something human in the intent. The Veth's expansion was more like a tide. It wasn't that they didn't know you were there. It was that your being there was a logistical condition, not a moral one. The question they were always asking, the only question they had was, how useful, how compliant, how efficiently can this resource be extracted? They were brilliant. Their technology outclassed human engineering by several generations in most applications. Their intelligence apparatus was near perfect within its own parameters. Their administrators were precise and predictable and almost impossible to deceive. Because deception required a model of the other mind, and the Veth had extremely sophisticated models of human behavior under pressure. What breaks, at what point, under what conditions. What they had never quite modeled correctly was what happens when you remove the pressure. Tendu explained this while they were planning the Fukuoka operation, drawing in chalk on the wall of the cedar stand's back room. The Veth's behavioral models were built on compliance data, humans under monitoring, under threat, under quota. Every adjustment they'd made to their suppression protocols in 16 months had been in response to observed human behavior in high-stress conditions. They had no good model for humans operating freely, for humans choosing, without coercion, what to do and how far to go. They know how we break, Tendo said. They don't know how we decide. Kaito thought about this for a long time. Then he said, they also don't know what we know about them. Tell me. The Candle Protocol. He'd seen it in the compliance director's operational briefs, buried in the administrative formatting. Every Vethan officer deployed to a zone has a bioresonance marker registered at the regional command node. When an officer is neutralized, the marker deactivates. The command node registers it. Standard procedure. 3 deactivations in a 48-hour window. Triggers a zone-wide review cycle that locks down all non-essential Veth operations for approximately 6 hours. Tendu put down his chalk. 6 hours, he said. 6 if Kaikado confirmed. While they audit, while they verify, while they wait for the review findings to be transmitted up the command chain, and for the response authorization to come back down, during which time the motor oil man, Fukuro, his name, was said slowly, the Sanadza depot data is sitting in the pending transfer queue, firmed, unfilled. And the compliance certification Kaelveth needs Sanada to sign, Kaito said, hasn't been signed. Because Ritsu hasn't been processed. Because the leverage doesn't exist. The woman with the cloud print scarf, Maria, said, enforcement officers in 48 hours. Yes, that's not easy, Nindo said. No, but it's possible. Kaito said, I know where 2 of them are going to be. I know their routes, I know their inspection windows. He paused. I spent 3 years memorizing the machine. Nindo looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, something in his face shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the space where trust might eventually grow. He looked like a man deciding whether to plant something in ground that had been fallow too long. 6 more things, he said. Name them. First operation was at Itoshima, 14 kilometers west of Fukuoka. The Veth compliance inspector they called Amber II, Kato's unofficial designation for Kale Veth II, ran a weekly documentation audit at the postal processing facility there. The audit was efficient, predictable, and as far as the Veth were concerned, completely secure. The inspector arrived at 1400 exactly. 3 Veth Genin, their term for enforcement subordinates, took position at the facility's access points as standard protocol. At 1408, the facility's water filtration alarm went off. The Veth used the facility's filtration system for part of their processing work. The alarm was not something they could ignore. The alarm had been triggered by Fukuro, who understood filtration systems the way some people understand music, by instinct and long practice, with an improvisatory joy that didn't look like expertise until something started working that shouldn't. Kita, who was fast and reckless, in the way that 16-year-olds with something to prove tend to be fast and reckless, went in through the maintenance access with the calm woman at his flank. Her name was Hannah, and she moved like water around obstacles, which was why Tendu had paired the 2 of them, the boy's energy, shaped by her precision. They were inside for 11 minutes. One of the Veth Genin followed the alarm into the filtration subdeck because protocol said, investigate, and protocol was all they had. What they did not have was a model for a boy of 16 who had grown up in the alleyways of what used to be Fukuoka and had spent the last 7 months learning from a 63-year-old master exactly where a Veth enforcement subordinate sensory clusters were located and how to disrupt them without causing a transmittable physiological distress signal. Kita was reckless. He was also a very fast learner. The Genin's bioresonance marker deactivated at 1419. The Amber Eye inspector continued the audit, unaware, for another 22 minutes before the localized communication blackout, Kaito, had engineered using a modified compliance network repeater node, made it impossible to do anything further. By the time the blackout lifted and the command node registered the deactivated marker, the facility was quiet, the team was 3 kilometers out, and the inspector was filing a confusion report in increasingly agitated bureaucratic language. 1 candle. The second operation was harder, and Nindo ran it personally. The Veth Regional Command had a communications relay on the summit of Seferi Mountain, a compact, elegant structure that handled roughly 40% of the zone's enforcement traffic. It was staffed by 2 officers on a rotating schedule and was, theoretically, completely inaccessible. Veth resonance barrier on the approach perimeter, atmospheric sensor web, covering the last 200 meters of approach, and a command link that auto-triggered if any unauthorized signature entered the buffer zone. Nindo didn't approach through the perimeter. He had been watching the relay for 3 months. He knew that once per week, the relay ran a thermal calibration cycle that created a 4-minute window in the sensor web's upper altitude coverage, not enough for a Veth approach vector, which required a minimum of 8 minutes, but enough for a human who was comfortable with heights and had a very specific understanding of exactly where the sensor nodes were positioned. He went up the rock face in the dark, no equipment the Veth could read, using the gaps in the sensor web's field coverage that he had mapped by observation and by the kind of patience that only comes from having lost things you couldn't get back and deciding not to lose anything else. It took him 27 minutes to reach the relay platform. He was inside the sensor blind for exactly 3 minutes and 51 seconds, 2 candles. He came back, down the mountain, with his knuckles bleeding, and the quiet look of a man who had made an exchange he considered fair. Kato watched him wrap his hands without comment. Some things you don't offer commentary on. One more, Tendu said. One more, Nindo agreed. The third was Kale Veth itself. Kaito had argued against it. Not because it wasn't necessary. The candle protocol required 3 deactivations, and Kael'Veth was the most senior Veth enforcement officer in the Fukuoka zone, which meant the command node's response to losing the inspector would be proportionally more severe than a standard review cycle. But because Kael'Veth was not predictable the way the others were. Kael'Veth had updated its behavioral models. It had, over 16 months, been watching the captor network without fully naming it, and its audits had been getting closer. It knows something is there, Kaito said. It just doesn't know what. Then we give it something to look at, Tendu said. The something was Ritsu Sanada, not the real Ritsu. She was already north, moving toward the extraction corridor with Fukuro and 2 other network members. What Kael'Veth received was a compliance intelligence report, formatted precisely to its own documentation standards, indicating that the target had been relocated to a secondary holding site in Akata and required the inspector's personal authorization for continued assessing. The report was formatted by Kaito, who had spent 3 years doing exactly this work, and it was indistinguishable from genuine Compliance Corps documentation in every way he knew how to measure, which was every way there was. Kael'Veth came to Hakata at 0700. The secondary holding site was a converted warehouse near the old railway district, and it looked, from the outside, completely correct. The Veth resonance markers were genuine. The access configuration was consistent with core protocol. The atmospheric readings were clean. Because Kato had seeded it that way, over the previous 48 hours, piece by piece, in the hours before dawn, when the compliance network's monitoring coverage had its lowest density. The inspector entered alone. Protocol for personal authorization on a processing case was always solo, witness-free, unrecorded. The Veth had learned early that certain of their administrative procedures were better conducted without documentation. It was one of the things about them that told you everything you needed to know. Inside the warehouse it found Kaito, not hiding, standing in the open, in the middle of the empty floor, in the full light of the industrial floods, his core identification visible. Izumo, Kael'Veth said. The Veth voice was a layered thing, multiple frequencies, the meaning carried in the harmonics beneath the surface tone. The surface tone said was the name. What the harmonics said was, you are already processed, you are already decided. Inspector, Kaito said, you understand what this is. Yes, you've made a significant miscalculation. You are one person, a core defector. Whatever intelligence you believe you have about our operations. I don't have intelligence, Kaito said. I have information. The distinction was not one the Veth had a protocol for, and Kael'Veth paused. A fractional thing, 2 seconds, almost nothing. Kaito had learned to read the pauses. The candle protocol, Kaito said. 2 of your enforcement officers are already deactivated. Their markers registered at the command node 4 hours ago. You received the notification and decided to come here anyway, because you believed that this situation, me here, was the operational priority. Because you've been tracking something for 16 months and you thought this was your moment to close it. Another pause. Longer. You're not wrong, Rose said. This is yours moment, but it's also mine. He was not alone in the warehouse. He had known he wouldn't be, walking in. What he hadn't expected, even now, was how it felt to have them at his back. Nindo to his left, the motor oil smell of Fukuro. Somewhere above in the gantry, Kita behind him, in a position that was technically concealment but was slightly too loud for concealment because the kid was still working on patience. And somewhere beyond that, the calm presence of Hana and Maria doing what they always did, which was making sure the math added up. 7 people. A 63-year-old master who had given his granddaughter to this work. A 16-year-old boy who was reckless and growing into something harder and more precise. A weathered man who had spent 16 months deciding whether to trust the ground before he planted anything, and had apparently decided. None of them were soldiers. None of them had the Veth's technology, the Veth's perfect behavioral models, the Veth's centuries of expansion protocol. What they had was the thing the Veth had never successfully modeled, a free decision made together, people who had decided that the cost of compliance was higher than the cost of resistance. Kale Veth moved. Fast. The Veth were fast. Faster than a human reflex in direct opposition, but not faster than preparation, and they had been preparing for this for a very long time. The inspector had 4 limbs and a combat protocol refined over decades of enforcement work, and an absolute certainty. In the first seconds, what it was dealing with was a desperate defector making a last gesture before the machine caught up with him. It was wrong about that in approximately the way that mattered. Kaito had studied the sensory clusters. He'd studied them from core documentation, incident reports he'd flagged and filed, and quietly memorized over 3 years, from the same patient accumulation of detail that had let him open the quieting room's lock in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. When you work inside the machine long enough, you learn where the gears are. He didn't fight Kale Veth. He redirected it. 2 seconds. A specific point of pressure on the sensory cluster, beneath the left upper limb junction, the kind of maneuver that a Veth would never bother to anticipate. Because it required knowing Veth physiology, and no human should know Veth physiology with that precision. And then it was Nindo's moment, and Nindo didn't waste it. The bioresonance marker deactivated at 0714. Candles. The review cycle triggered at 0715. The command node, facing 3 senior marker deactivations in 41 hours, entered the mandatory audit protocol. All non-essential Veth operations in the Fukuoka zone suspended pending review. Pending transfer queue, the depot location data, the compliance certifications, the processing authorizations, locked for the duration. They had 6 hours, it was enough. Kato sat on the warehouse floor afterward, his back against a support strut, and did not do anything for approximately 3 minutes. This was, he realized, first time in 3 years that he had not been doing anything for the machine. Not doing anything against it either. Not right now, just sitting. Present. In a warehouse in Hakata with 6 other people and a thin winter light coming through the high windows and the sound of Keita outside saying something emphatic to Hana, who was presumably telling him he'd been too loud in his concealment position. Nindo sat down beside him, not next to him exactly, there was still space between them, but beside. 6 more things, Nindo said. You made 7, Kato said. The 7th was the one in the compliance records. When I flagged the wrong depot location. A pause. You flagged the wrong depot location. 8 months ago, I filed a documentation error on the inland depot survey. Incorrect coordinates. The Veth have been surveying the wrong site. He paused. I told myself it was a calibration mistake. I was pretty good at telling myself things. Nindo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You decided 8 months ago. I didn't know that's what I was doing. Nobody ever does. Tendu came in from the back entrance, moving with that retired hammer efficiency, and stood in the shaft of winter light and looked at them both. He said nothing for a moment. He had the look of a man assessing the state of a thing he'd been tending for a long time. The extraction corridor is clear, he said. Sonata's daughter reaches the northern node in approximately 4 hours. Her father has been informed. He will not sign the certification. The command node review will end in 6 hours, Kaido said. Yes, and after that it continues. Tendu said, that's the nature of it. We don't finish this in Hakata. We don't finish it in a day. I know. Do you? Not unkind. Just direct. The directness of a man who had seen people convince themselves of completion when what they'd achieved was a beginning. Kaido thought about Ritsu's face in the corridor, when she'd looked at him and stopped waiting. He thought about 3 years of excuses, and the exact moment he'd let them pass. He thought about a boy who was still too loud in his concealment position, but was learning. I know it doesn't end here, Kaito said. I know what I burned. I know what I'm building toward is longer and harder than anything I did for them. He paused. I also know I haven't slept in 36 hours and there's very bad tea in the cedar stand. Tendu looked at him for a moment, then something that might have been the corner of a smile. There is, he said. Come on. They put out the candles. That was how Kaido thought about it, after. Not in the grand terms that the situation probably deserved, not with the weight that would come later, in the years of work ahead, when the full shape of what they were doing became visible. He thought about it the way it felt in the warehouse, in the thin winter light. Specific, concrete, earned. 3 candles, 6 hours. A network of 7 people who had each decided something freely, in the absence of threat, in the presence of each other. The Veth's models did not account for that. They had not built a protocol for people who chose. On the way north to the cedar stand, with Nindo at his left, and Kita, ahead being slightly too loud in his excitement at having done the thing and survived it, Kaito found himself thinking about a habit he'd had before any of this. Before the Corps, before the ships, when he was a student, and the worst thing on his mind was a statistics exam. He used to hum when he was thinking. His mother's habit passed to him without either of them noticing. He hadn't done it in 3 years. The machine didn't like ambient sound. Compliance personnel were expected to maintain a neutral acoustic signature. He hummed, now, very quietly, walking north in the early morning through the bare cedar trees, the sound barely above breath, no specific song, just the shape of one, something from before. Kita turned around and looked at him, curious. Nothing, Kaito said. Walk. Kita walked. Kaito hummed. Tendu, 5 meters ahead, gave no sign that he'd heard. But his pace adjusted by half a step, not slowing, just settling. And his shoulders were a fraction less tight than they had been in the warehouse. Was what peace of mind looked like on a 63-year-old man who had been carrying this work for a long time. Small things, that was where the human texture was. Not in the big victory, not in the moment when the third marker deactivated and the review cycle triggered. In the hum and the bad tea and the kid being too loud and Nindo planting something's in ground that had been fallow too long. And a girl who had stopped waiting and started something. The Veth looked at humans and saw furniture, predictable, quantifiable. A system of inputs and responses, breakable at known stress thresholds. They had never figured out that the human thing wasn't the breaking. It was the deciding to begin again, quietly, in the dark with bad tea, and someone you're not sure you trust yet, and a 16-year-old who is just barely too loud and a long road that goes further than you can see from here. And you start anyway, because you looked at someone who needed you to, and you let the excuses pass. The cedar stand was warm when they got there. Miki had made tea, the same bad tea, the same cracked mugs, the same narrow table covered in chalk-marked planning documents and frayed signal cables. Kaito sat down at the table. Keita sat across from him, still vibrating slightly from the morning, and put his elbows on the table and leaned forward and said, "So, what's next?" "What's next?" Kaito looked at the chalk marks on the wall, the depot surveys, the compliance protocols, the 3 years of knowledge he hadn't burned yet. All the things he knew about the machine, which was not nothing, which was in fact quite a lot, which was maybe the most useful thing a man could bring to a network like this. He reached for a piece of chalk. "There's a secondary relay node," he said, "on the Genkai coast. The Veth run a monthly data consolidation there. All compliance records from 6 zones, aggregated and transmitted for central review. If we can access the consolidation point during the transmission window." "When's the window?" Kuro said. appearing from somewhere with motor oil on his hands and his coat pocket bulging with components. 17 days. 17 days, Tendu said. It's enough time, Kaido said. Tendu looked at him for a moment. Then he sat down and took a piece of chalk and said, "Show me." Kato showed him. Outside, through the single high window of the cedar stand's back room, the morning was coming in. Cold and clear. The kind of winter light that doesn't soften anything, but makes the shapes of things precise. The bare trees, the mountain ridge, the coast somewhere beyond it, and past the coast, the ships that had come down and changed the shape of the world, and somewhere in those ships a command node running an audit, paused, temporarily locked, waiting for a review to tell it what had happened and what to do. It didn't know yet what had happened. It didn't know what they were going to do. Kato put chalk to wall and began.